David pulled into the parking lot of the grocery store, his black BMW finding a spot between a beat-up Honda and a shiny pickup truck. The morning sun was already warming up what promised to be another busy Saturday. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, looking at the building he owned but rarely visited in person. 3 years ago, when he bought this place, it seemed like a smart investment. The location was perfect, right in the heart of Oakwood Heights, a growing suburban community. The numbers looked good on paper, and his district manager always sent positive reports. But lately something had been bothering him. It started with small things. A comment from his neighbor about feeling unwelcome when she shopped there. A review online mentioning unfriendly staff. Nothing too serious, but enough to make him wonder what was really happening inside his store. David stepped out of his car, dressed in his usual weekend clothes. After his morning run, he had thrown on comfortable jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and his favorite sneakers. His wife had laughed, saying he looked more like he was heading to the gym than checking on a business. That was exactly the point. He wanted to see how his store operated when nobody knew the owner was watching. The automatic doors whooshed open and he walked into the familiar buzz of a busy grocery store. Shopping carts rattled across the floor, children asked their parents for treats, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery filled the air. Everything seemed normal enough. David grabbed a small cart and began walking through the aisles, pretending to shop while actually observing. He watched how the employees interacted with customers, how clean the shelves were, and whether the produce looked fresh. Most of what he saw made him proud. The store was well maintained, the staff seemed busy and professional, and customers were finding what they needed. In the produce section, he noticed Mrs. Chen, an elderly Asian woman, asking one of his employees about the best apples for baking. The young man took time to explain the difference between varieties and even helped her pick out the best ones. David smiled. This was exactly the kind of service he wanted to see. He moved through the store slowly, picking up items he actually needed. Milk for his morning coffee, some bread, a few bananas, and a bottle of orange juice. Simple things that any customer might buy on a Saturday morning. The pharmacy section was busy, with people picking up prescriptions and asking questions about over-the-counter medicines. The pharmacist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, patiently explained dosages to a confused customer. Another good sign. But as David continued his tour, he started noticing smaller details that concerned him. In the electronics section, he saw a teenage boy looking at phone chargers while an employee watched him suspiciously from nearby. The kid wasn't doing anything wrong, just comparing prices, but the employee's body language suggested he expected trouble. Near the frozen foods, David overheard a conversation between two cashiers on their break. One was complaining about having to work weekend shifts, saying the store attracted the wrong kind of people on weekends. The other laughed and agreed, making comments that made David's jaw clench. He made a mental note to address this with management. The more he walked around, the more he realized that his store had developed two different personalities. During quieter weekday hours, it probably ran exactly as he intended. But on busy weekends, when the customer base was more diverse, some attitudes were showing that he didn't like at all. David had built his business empire by treating everyone fairly. Growing up in a working-class family, he understood what it felt like to be judged by your appearance or your neighborhood. When he made his first $1 million in real estate, he promised himself he would create businesses that welcomed everyone. Apparently, that message hadn't reached all of his employees. He finished gathering his items and headed toward the checkout lanes. Several were open with lines of varying lengths. David chose one that seemed to be moving quickly, ending up behind a young mother with 2 kids and a cart full of groceries. The cashier at his chosen lane was a woman in her late 20s with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her name tag read Ashley. She seemed efficient enough, scanning items quickly and making small talk with customers. David watched her interact with the family in front of him, noticing how her demeanor was friendly and professional. The mother finished paying and gathered her children, wishing Ashley a good weekend. Ashley smiled and thanked her, then looked up at David as he approached with his small selection of items. Something changed in her expression immediately. The friendly smile faded, replaced by something cooler and more guarded. David noticed it but didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe she was tired or having a bad day or dealing with personal problems. Everyone had rough patches. He placed his items on the conveyor belt and offered a polite "good morning." Ashley nodded but didn't return the greeting with the same warmth she had shown previous customers. She began scanning his items mechanically without the small talk she had been making with others. David pulled out his wallet, ready to pay. He had several credit cards, his driver's license, and some cash. Everything a normal customer would have. But as Ashley finished scanning his items, he could feel her watching him more closely than seemed necessary. The total came to $23.47. David pulled out his American Express card, a premium card that reflected his business success but looked like any other piece of plastic. He handed it to Ashley with a friendly smile, hoping to warm up the interaction. Instead of taking the card normally, Ashley held it up to the light, examining it as if she expected it to be fake. She looked at the name on the card, then at David, then back at the card. Her expression suggested she found something suspicious about a simple grocery purchase. David felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He had experienced this before years ago when he was just starting out in business. The suspicious looks, the extra scrutiny, the assumption that he didn't belong in certain spaces. He had hoped those days were behind him, especially in his own store. But he remained calm, giving Ashley the benefit of the doubt. Maybe the card reader was acting up, or maybe she was new and being extra careful. There could be innocent explanations for her behavior. Around him, the store continued its Saturday morning rhythm. Families filled their carts with groceries for the week ahead. Elderly couples moved slowly through the aisles, checking items off their lists. Teenagers grabbed snacks and drinks. It was exactly the kind of diverse, busy atmosphere that made a grocery store profitable. David glanced at the other checkout lanes, watching how other cashiers interacted with their customers. They all seemed relaxed and friendly, processing purchases with the kind of routine efficiency that comes from experience. Nothing about their behavior suggested the tension he was feeling in his own lane. Ashley was still examining his credit card when the customer behind David cleared his throat impatiently. The line was starting to back up, and people were beginning to notice that something unusual was happening. David could feel their eyes on him. Though he wasn't sure why a simple grocery purchase was taking so long, he was about to find out just how wrong this situation was about to go. Ashley held David's credit card for what felt like an eternity, turning it over in her hands as if she were examining evidence at a crime scene. The line behind him was growing longer, and David could hear people shifting impatiently, checking their watches and sighing. "Is there a problem with the card?" David asked politely, keeping his voice calm and friendly. He had learned long ago that getting defensive or angry in situations like this only made things worse. Ashley looked up at him with narrowed eyes. "I need to see some ID," she said curtly, her tone completely different from the warm voice she had used with previous customers. David was puzzled. In all his years of shopping, he had rarely been asked for ID when using a credit card, especially for such a small purchase. But he reached for his wallet anyway, pulling out his driver's license and handing it to her. Ashley took the license and held it next to the credit card, comparing the names with exaggerated care. She studied his photo, then looked at his face, then back at the photo. Her expression suggested she was solving some complex puzzle rather than processing a routine grocery purchase. "David Thompson," she read aloud, loud enough for other customers to hear. "And this is your card?" The question struck David as odd. Of course it was his card. Why else would he have handed it to her? But he nodded patiently. "Yes, that's my card and my ID." Ashley didn't seem satisfied with his answer. She held the card up to the light again, as if checking for watermarks or other security features. David noticed that she hadn't done this with any other customer's payment method. The man who had paid before him had used an identical American Express card, and Ashley had processed it without a second glance. "This is a pretty expensive card," Ashley commented, her voice carrying a tone that suggested she found this suspicious. "Are you sure it's not someone else's?" David felt his patience beginning to wear thin, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's definitely my card," he said evenly. "I've had it for years." The customers behind him were becoming more restless. A woman with 2 young children looked at her watch and muttered something under her breath. An elderly man leaning on a walker shifted his weight from foot to foot. David felt bad that Ashley's behavior was affecting other shoppers, but he wasn't sure how to resolve the situation without causing a scene. Ashley finally swiped the card through her reader, but instead of the quick beep that usually indicated approval, the machine made a different sound. She frowned at the screen, then tried swiping again. Same result. "The card's not going through," she announced loud enough for half the store to hear. Her tone suggested she had expected this outcome all along. David was confused. He had used the card just that morning at the coffee shop near his gym, and it had worked fine. "Can you try running it as credit instead of debit?" he suggested. Ashley gave him a look that clearly said she thought he was trying to scam the system. "I know how to do my job," she replied sharply. She tried the card again, with the same result. By now, several customers in nearby lines had turned to watch the drama unfolding. David could feel their stares and hear their whispered conversations. Some seemed sympathetic to his situation, while others appeared to be enjoying the show. "Maybe there's something wrong with your card reader," David suggested, trying to be helpful. "I could try a different card or pay with cash." But Ashley wasn't interested in solutions. She was holding his credit card and ID as if they were evidence of wrongdoing, and her voice was getting louder with each exchange. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside," she said, her tone now openly hostile. "There's obviously something wrong here, and I can't complete this transaction." David felt a familiar burning in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced years ago when people made assumptions about him based on his appearance. But he had learned to channel that feeling into calm persistence rather than anger. "I'd like to speak with your manager, please," he said quietly. Ashley's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like triumph. "Oh, so now you want to make trouble?" "I thought so." The comment was so unfair and unprofessional that David had to take a deep breath before responding. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't been rude, hadn't done anything except try to buy groceries with his own money and his own credit card. But somehow, Ashley had turned him into the problem. "I'm not making trouble," David said, his voice still calm, but with an edge of steel. "I'm a customer trying to complete a purchase, and I'd like to speak with someone who can help resolve the situation." Ashley looked around dramatically, as if David had just threatened her. "Okay, that's it. I'm calling security." The words hit David like a physical blow. Security? For what? For trying to buy milk and bread with his own credit card? He looked around at the other customers, some of whom were now openly staring. A few had pulled out their phones, though whether to call for help or record the confrontation he couldn't tell. "Ma'am, I think you're overreacting," said the elderly man behind David in line. His voice was kind but firm. "This gentleman hasn't done anything wrong. I've been watching the whole thing." Ashley whirled around to face the older man. "Sir, I need you to mind your own business. I know what I'm doing here." But other customers were beginning to speak up too. The woman with the children said, "He's right. I saw the whole thing too. This man has been nothing but polite." A younger man from a different line called out, "Why, don't you just try a different register? Maybe your machine is broken." Ashley's face was turning red, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. "I don't need customers telling me how to do my job, and I especially don't need people defending shoplifters." The word hung in the air like a bomb. Shoplifter. David felt every eye in the area turn toward him, and he saw the exact moment when some people's expressions changed from confusion to suspicion. Ashley had just publicly accused him of stealing, based on nothing more than a credit card that wouldn't process and her own obvious bias. David's hands were shaking slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I haven't shoplifted anything. These are my items, and I'm trying to pay for them with my own money." But Ashley was on a roll now, apparently feeling empowered by the attention she was receiving. "That's what they all say, and that credit card is probably stolen too." The accusation was so outrageous that several customers gasped. David felt like he was living through a nightmare, being publicly humiliated in his own store by his own employee. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. A security guard finally appeared, a middle-aged Hispanic man who looked uncomfortable with the situation. David had seen him in the store's employee files. His name was Carlos Rodriguez, and he had worked there for almost 2 years with an excellent record. "What's the problem here?" Carlos asked, his tone professional but cautious. Ashley immediately launched into her version of events, painting David as a suspicious character who had tried to use a fraudulent credit card and then became aggressive when questioned. Her description bore no resemblance to what had actually happened, but she told it with such conviction that David wondered if she actually believed her own story. Carlos looked at David with a mixture of professionalism and sympathy. Unlike Ashley, he seemed to understand that something wasn't right about the situation. "Sir, can you tell me what happened from your perspective?" David explained the situation calmly, describing how he had simply tried to buy groceries and been subjected to unusual scrutiny and ultimately false accusations. As he spoke, several customers nodded in agreement, and the elderly man spoke up to confirm David's version of events. But Ashley wasn't finished. "Don't believe him," she said loudly. "These people always have some sob story, and look how he's dressed. Does he look like someone who can afford to shop here?" The comment was so blatantly prejudiced that even Carlos looked shocked. David glanced down at his casual weekend clothes, the same type of outfit worn by half the customers in the store. There was nothing unusual or suspicious about jeans and a hoodie on a Saturday morning. The situation was spiraling out of control, and David realized that it was time to reveal who he really was. He had wanted to observe his store anonymously, but Ashley had made that impossible. The question now was whether anyone would believe him when he told them the truth. The crowd around the checkout lane was growing larger by the minute. What had started as a simple grocery purchase had turned into a public spectacle, with Ashley at the center, seemingly enjoying every moment of the attention she was receiving. Carlos, the security guard, was trying to manage the situation professionally, but Ashley kept interrupting him whenever he tried to speak with David. She had appointed herself as the star of her own drama, and she wasn't about to let anyone else take control of the narrative. "I've been working retail for 8 years, Ashley announced to the gathering crowd, her voice carrying across the store. "And I can spot trouble from a mile away. This man came in here acting suspicious from the moment he walked up to my register." David wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but the situation had moved far beyond funny. Other customers were pulling out their phones now, some recording the confrontation, others possibly calling friends or family to tell them about the drama unfolding at the grocery store. An older woman David hadn't noticed before stepped forward from the crowd. She was well-dressed, probably in her 60s, with gray hair and intelligent eyes. "Excuse me," she said firmly, addressing Ashley directly. "I was in line behind this gentleman and I saw everything. He was nothing but polite to you. You're the one who created this entire situation." Ashley turned her attention to the older woman with obvious irritation. "Ma'am, you don't understand what's happening here. I'm trained to recognize suspicious behavior, and this man was showing all the signs." "What sign?" the woman asked pointedly. "Being black in your store? Because from where I stood, that seemed to be his only crime." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several people in the crowd murmured agreement while others looked uncomfortable. Ashley's face turned bright red, and for a moment David thought she might actually back down. Instead, she doubled down even harder. "This has nothing to do with race," Ashley said loudly, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what it had to do with. "This is about a suspicious person trying to use a credit card that doesn't work, in clothes that don't match his supposed lifestyle, acting nervous and evasive." David almost couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked down at his weekend outfit again, wondering what about jeans and a hoodie suggested criminal behavior. Half the people in the store were dressed similarly, but none of them were being accused of fraud or theft. A teenage boy near the back of the crowd called out, "Lady, you're totally out of line. I've been watching this whole thing and you're the only one acting crazy." His comment seemed to embolden others. A middle-aged man said, "Yeah, I use that same type of credit card and sometimes they don't work on the first try. That doesn't make me a criminal." But Ashley was beyond listening to reason. She was fully committed to her performance now, and the growing opposition from the crowd only seemed to fuel her determination to prove she was right. "You people don't understand," she said, addressing the entire crowd. "You don't work in retail. You don't know what we deal with every day. We have to be suspicious or we get robbed blind." Carlos, the security guard, looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. He stepped closer to Ashley and said quietly, "Maybe we should just let this gentleman pay with cash or try a different card. There's no need to make this into a bigger issue." Ashley whirled on him with surprising fury. "Are you questioning my judgment, Carlos? Because last time I checked, customer service was my department, not yours." The exchange revealed something David hadn't expected. Ashley wasn't just having a bad day or making a mistake in judgment. She was someone who genuinely believed she had the right to treat certain customers with suspicion and hostility, and she was willing to defend that right even when it was clearly wrong. A woman in her 30s, holding a toddler, spoke up from the crowd. "I shop here every week and I've never seen anything like this. This is embarrassing for the store." "Then maybe you should shop somewhere else," Ashley snapped back, apparently not caring that she was driving away customers with her behavior. David realized that the situation had reached a point where Ashley was no longer thinking rationally. She had invested so much in being right about him that she couldn't back down without losing face, and in her mind, losing face to a black customer was apparently unthinkable. The store manager finally appeared, drawn by the commotion. She was a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and a tired expression that suggested she had been dealing with problems all morning. Her name tag identified her as Janet Williams. "What's going on here?" Janet asked, looking around at the crowd with obvious concern. Ashley immediately launched into her story again, but this time her version had grown even more dramatic. According to her, David had been acting suspiciously from the moment he entered the store, had tried to use multiple fraudulent credit cards, and had become aggressive and threatening when questioned. David listened to the fabricated account with growing amazement. Ashley was describing events that had never happened, creating a narrative that painted her as a hero protecting the store from a dangerous criminal. When Ashley finished her performance, Janet turned to David with a professional but cautious expression. "Sir, I'd like to hear your side of the story." David started to explain what had actually happened, but before he could finish, Ashley interrupted again. "Don't let him manipulate you, Janet. These people are always good with words. That's how they get away with stuff." The phrase "these people" sent a chill through the crowd. Even customers who had been neutral up to that point began to look uncomfortable. Ashley had just revealed the ugly truth behind her behavior in a way that couldn't be misunderstood. Janet's expression changed immediately. As a manager, she had undoubtedly been trained to recognize discriminatory language, and Ashley had just used it in front of dozens of witnesses with cell phone cameras. "Ashley," Janet said carefully, "I think you need to step away from the register and let me handle this situation." But Ashley wasn't ready to give up her spotlight. "No way, this is my register and this is my customer. I started this and I'm going to finish it." The level of unprofessional behavior was so extreme that even David, with all his business experience, was struggling to process it. He had fired employees before for various reasons, but he had never encountered someone so determined to destroy their own career in such a public way. A man in his 20s who had been recording the confrontation with his phone stepped forward. "Ma'am, I've got this whole thing on video. You do realize that, right? This is probably going to be all over social media by tonight." For the first time since the confrontation began, Ashley looked genuinely worried. The mention of social media and video evidence seemed to penetrate her anger in a way that customer complaints and manager intervention had not. But instead of backing down, she made the situation even worse. "You can't record in here without permission," she said, though she was clearly making up rules as she went along. "And if you post anything about me, I'll sue you for invasion of privacy." The young man laughed. "Lady, we're in a public place and you're the one making a scene. I'm pretty sure I can record whatever I want." Several other people held up their phones, making it clear that multiple videos of the incident were being recorded from different angles. Ashley looked around at the cameras with growing panic, finally starting to understand that her behavior would have consequences beyond this moment. David watched the realization dawn on her face and almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She had created this situation through her own prejudice and unprofessional behavior, and now she was facing the reality that actions have consequences. But even as panic set in, Ashley made one final attempt to control the narrative. "Fine," she said, her voice getting shriller. "Record whatever you want. But when this man gets arrested for fraud and theft, don't come crying to me." I tried to protect this store and nobody wanted to listen. It was at that moment that David decided he had heard enough. The time for anonymity was over, and the time for truth had arrived. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card that would change everything. David pulled out his business card with deliberate calm, the small piece of paper feeling heavier than it should in his hand. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing that something important was about to happen. Even Ashley seemed to realize that the dynamic was shifting, though she couldn't yet understand why. "Janet," David said, addressing the store manager directly, "I think we need to have a private conversation." He handed her the business card, watching her face as she read it. Her expression changed from professional concern to complete shock in the span of 2 seconds. The color drained from her face as she looked up at David, then back down at the card, then up at him again. "Oh my God," she whispered, barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. Ashley, still operating on adrenaline and righteous indignation, couldn't resist inserting herself into the moment. "What's that supposed to be? Some fake business card? I told you these people always have tricks." Janet turned to look at Ashley with an expression that could have frozen water. "Ashley, I need you to stop talking. Right now." But Ashley was beyond listening to anyone, even her manager. The crowd, the cameras, the attention had all gone to her head, and she was determined to see her performance through to the end. "Don't tell me to stop talking," Ashley said defiantly. "I'm the one protecting this store from criminals, and instead of backing me up, you're taking his side. This is exactly what's wrong with management these days." David watched Janet's face as Ashley continued to dig her own professional grave. As a business owner himself, he could see the exact moment when Janet realized that this situation was going to cost the store much more than a simple customer service complaint. "Ashley," Janet said, her voice tight with control, "you need to go to the back office immediately. We'll discuss this privately." "I'm not going anywhere," Ashley replied, crossing her arms defiantly. "Not until this man is arrested for trying to steal from our store." The crowd had grown to include at least 30 people, with more arriving every minute as word spread through the store about the confrontation. David could see employees from other departments gathering at the edges of the crowd, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and concern. Carlos, the security guard, stepped closer to David and spoke quietly. "Sir, I'm really sorry about this. This isn't how we normally handle situations." David nodded, appreciating the man's professionalism. "I understand, Carlos. You're just doing your job." Janet was still staring at the business card in her hand, probably trying to figure out how to handle a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. David decided to help her out. "Janet," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the crowd, "my name is David Thompson and I own this store." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Ashley stopped talking, her mouth hanging open as she processed what she had just heard. The crowd stood frozen, everyone trying to understand what this revelation meant for the drama they had been witnessing. "You own the store?" asked the elderly man who had defended David earlier, his voice filled with amazement. David nodded. "I own this store and 12 others in the region. I came in today to shop and observe, and I had no intention of revealing my identity. But circumstances have made that impossible." Ashley's face went through a series of expressions, from disbelief to confusion to dawning horror. "That's impossible," she said weakly. "You're lying. Show me some proof." David pulled out his driver's license and handed it to Janet along with his business card. "You can verify my identity through corporate headquarters. The number is on the card." Janet nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she examined the documents. "I recognize your name from company communications." Oh God, I can't believe this is happening. But Ashley still wasn't ready to accept reality. Anyone can fake a business card and an ID. That doesn't prove anything. And even if you do own this place, that doesn't change the fact that you were acting suspicious. The comment was so absurd that several people in the crowd started laughing. The idea that someone acting suspiciously by trying to buy groceries in their own store was beyond ridiculous. David looked around at the crowd, many of whom were still recording with their phones. He realized that whatever happened next would probably end up online, and he wanted to handle the situation in a way that reflected well on his business and his values. "I'd like to see the security footage of this entire incident," David said to Janet. "From the moment I entered the store until now." Janet nodded quickly. "Of course, we can review it immediately." And I'd like statements from the employees and customers who witnessed what happened. Several people in the crowd immediately volunteered to provide statements. The elderly man who had first defended David stepped forward. I saw the whole thing from the beginning. This young lady treated you differently from the moment you approached her register. The well-dressed older woman who had called out Ashley's behavior earlier also stepped forward. I'd be happy to give a statement. What I witnessed was clear discrimination, and everyone here saw it. Even some of the store employees were nodding in agreement. David noticed that several of them looked embarrassed by Ashley's behavior, as if they were ashamed to be associated with her actions. Ashley looked around at the faces surrounding her, finally beginning to understand that she had badly misjudged the situation, but instead of apologizing or showing remorse, she chose to double down one final time. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice getting defensive again. "Even if he does own this store, that doesn't mean I was wrong to be suspicious. He came in here dressed like a thug, acting weird, and his credit card didn't work. Any reasonable person would have been suspicious." The comment was so tone-deaf that even Janet visibly cringed. David looked at Ashley with something approaching pity. She was so committed to justifying her behavior that she couldn't see how every word she spoke was making things worse for herself. "Ashley," David said quietly, "I was dressed in weekend clothes, the same as half the customers in this store. I was polite and patient throughout our interaction, and my credit card didn't work because of a security hold that happens sometimes with high-limit cards. None of those things justified the way you treated me." "High-limit card?" Ashley said skeptically. "Right. Like I'm supposed to believe that." David pulled out his wallet and showed her the card that had caused all the trouble. It was a black American Express Centurion card, the kind reserved for customers who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Even Ashley, with her limited knowledge of credit cards, seemed to recognize what she was looking at. The crowd pressed closer to get a better look, and several people gasped when they saw the distinctive black card. The young man who had been recording the incident whistled softly. "Dude, that's like the most exclusive credit card in the world." Ashley stared at the card as if it were a poisonous snake. The evidence of David's wealth and status was literally in her face, contradicting every assumption she had made about him based on his appearance. But instead of apologizing, she found a new angle to justify her behavior. "Well, how was I supposed to know that?" she said defensively. "Rich people should dress better when they go shopping. If you had dressed appropriately for someone with money, none of this would have happened." The comment was so outrageous that several people in the crowd actually gasped. David realized that Ashley was going to keep digging her hole deeper, no matter what evidence was presented to her. Janet finally found her voice again. "Ashley, you need to stop talking right now. You're making this situation worse for yourself and for the store." But Ashley was past the point of listening to advice. She had invested so much in being right that she literally couldn't back down, even when faced with overwhelming evidence that she was wrong. "I don't care who he is," she said defiantly. "I did my job and I'd do it again. If people want to be treated with respect, they should dress respectfully and act appropriately." David looked around at the crowd, seeing the mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief on their faces. He realized that Ashley had just provided the perfect example of the kind of employee he never wanted working for him. David looked at Ashley with a mixture of sadness and resolve. In all his years of business, he had never encountered an employee so determined to justify discriminatory behavior. Her refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing, even when confronted with clear evidence, told him everything he needed to know about her character. "Ashley," he said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making important decisions, "your employment with this store is terminated. Effective immediately." The words hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Some people cheered, others gasped, and a few started applauding. Ashley stood frozen, her mouth open, as if she couldn't quite process what had just happened. "You can't fire me," she said weakly, her defiance finally beginning to crack. "I haven't done anything wrong. I was just doing my job." Janet stepped forward, her professional training finally kicking in despite the unusual circumstances. "Ashley, please collect your personal belongings from your locker and turn in your name tag and any store property. Security will escort you out." The reality of the situation finally hit Ashley full force. Her face crumpled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed to understand the consequences of her actions. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice breaking. "I've worked here for 8 months. I've never been written up. I don't deserve this. David felt a moment of sympathy for her, but it passed quickly. Ashley, you publicly humiliated a customer based on racial prejudice. You falsely accused me of theft and fraud. You created a hostile environment for other customers and employees. These aren't minor mistakes. These are serious violations of company policy and basic human decency. The crowd murmured agreement and several people nodded vigorously. The elderly man who had first offended David stepped forward again. Young lady, I've been shopping for 70 years, and I've never seen a customer treated the way you treated this gentleman. You should be ashamed of yourself. Ashley looked around at the faces surrounding her, finally seeing the disapproval and disgust that her behavior had generated. The phones that were still recording would ensure that her actions were preserved forever, a permanent record of her prejudice and unprofessionalism. I have bills to pay, she said desperately, appealing to David directly. I have rent due next week. Please don't do this. I'm sorry if I made a mistake, but everyone makes mistakes. David shook his head slowly. This wasn't a mistake, Ashley. A mistake is forgetting to give someone their receipt or accidentally double charging for an item. What you did was deliberate discrimination, and you defended it even when you knew you were wrong. Carlos, the security guard, approached Ashley with professional courtesy but firm resolve. Ma'am, I need to escort you to collect your things and then to the exit. As Ashley was led away, still protesting her innocence, the crowd began to disperse. But many customers lingered, wanting to talk to David about what they had witnessed. The well-dressed older woman who had spoken up during the confrontation approached him first. I want you to know that I've been shopping here for 2 years, and I've never seen anything like this before. Your other employees are usually wonderful. David thanked her, genuinely appreciative of her support during the difficult situation. I'm sorry you had to witness that. It's not representative of the values we try to instill in our staff. The young man who had recorded the incident held up his phone. Mr. Thompson, I've got the whole thing on video. Would you like me to send it to you? It might be useful for training purposes or if there are any legal issues. David nodded gratefully. That would be very helpful. Thank you for documenting what happened. Over the next hour, David spoke with dozens of customers and employees about the incident. Most were supportive and understanding, recognizing that Ashley's behavior was an aberration rather than a reflection of the store's culture. But a few customers admitted they had noticed similar attitudes from certain employees on previous visits. This feedback troubled David deeply. If Ashley's prejudice had been visible to customers, it meant the problem might be more widespread than he had initially thought. He made a mental note to conduct a thorough review of hiring and training practices across all his stores. Janet approached him with a thick folder of paperwork. Mr. Thompson, I've gathered statements from 12 customers and 5 employees who witnessed the incident. I've also pulled the security footage from multiple angles. Everything confirms your account of what happened. David reviewed the materials quickly, noting the consistency of the witness statements. Every single account supported his version of events and contradicted Ashley's claims about his behavior. Janet, I want you to schedule mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees within the next 30 days, he said, and I want to implement an anonymous reporting system so customers can report discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. Janet nodded eagerly. I think that's an excellent idea. To be honest, I've been concerned about some attitudes among the staff, but I wasn't sure how to address them without specific incidents to point to. Well, now we have a very specific incident, David replied grimly, and I want to make sure it never happens again. As word of the incident spread through social media, David found himself at the center of a much larger conversation about discrimination in retail settings. The videos recorded by customers had indeed gone viral, generating millions of views and thousands of comments. Most of the response was positive, with people praising David for his calm handling of the situation and his decisive action in firing Ashley. But there was also a significant amount of criticism and debate, with some people arguing that Ashley's behavior, while inappropriate, didn't warrant termination. David addressed these concerns in a statement posted on the store's social media accounts. Discrimination has no place in our business or in our society. When employees treat customers differently based on race, appearance, or any other irrelevant factor, they violate our core values and create a hostile environment for everyone. "We will not tolerate this behavior regardless of the circumstances." The statement generated even more discussion, but David was satisfied that he had taken a clear stand on an important issue. 3 weeks later, David returned to the same store for another unannounced visit. This time he dressed in a business suit, making his identity and status immediately obvious to the staff. The difference in his reception was dramatic. Every employee he encountered was polite, professional, and eager to help. But David wondered how much of this change was due to his appearance versus genuine improvement in attitudes and training. To test this, he asked his assistant Tyler, a young black man who worked in his corporate office, to visit the store dressed casually and report on his experience. Tyler's report was positive, noting that he was treated with courtesy and respect. Throughout his visit, David also implemented regular mystery shopper visits by people of various backgrounds to ensure consistent treatment of all customers. The program revealed some ongoing issues at other stores in his chain, leading to additional training and, in a few cases, more terminations. 6 months after the incident, David received a letter from Ashley. She had found a new job at a different retail store, but said she had learned from her experience and wanted to apologize for her behavior. She asked if he would consider providing a neutral reference for future employment opportunities. David thought about the request for several days before responding. While he appreciated her apparent growth and willingness to apologize, he ultimately decided that the consequences of discriminatory behavior needed to be lasting and meaningful. In his reply, he wished Ashley well in her personal growth but explained that he could not provide a reference that might help her secure positions where she could potentially discriminate against other customers. The incident had taught David valuable lessons about the importance of regular, hands-on management and the need for continuous vigilance against discrimination in all its forms. He had always believed in treating all people fairly, but Ashley's behavior had shown him that good intentions at the top weren't enough to prevent problems at the ground level. A year later, the store had become known in the community as a model of inclusive customer service. Employee turnover had decreased, customer satisfaction scores had improved, and the business was more profitable than ever. David still made regular, unannounced visits to all his stores, sometimes dressed casually and sometimes in business attire. The message to his employees was clear. Every customer deserved to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance, and the owner was always watching to ensure those values were upheld. The incident with Ashley had been painful and embarrassing, but it had ultimately made David a better business owner and created positive change that benefited thousands of customers. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important lessons come from the most difficult experiences.